Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now today I'm on the hunt for some of London's greatest strikes or labour disputes, moments when the workers decided enough is enough and they went out and protested against their evil managers. So we'll have a look at a few interesting places. Now I'm starting here in Bow in East London, specifically by this lovely block of flats that exists now. But in 1888 this was the site of Bryant and May, matchmakers. They would make the matches that you would use to light the fires. And there was a very significant strike here in the summer of 1888 known as the Match Girls' Strike. Now, it was called the Match Girls' Strike because it involved lots of young women who were protesting against the conditions they had to work in. Really significant ones. One was when they had to deal with this horrible chemical called phosphorus, which actually eventually did something to your jaw called phossy jaw, where the jaw withered away. Horrendous conditions. Also, there were ludicrously draconian, horrible fines. You know, if you dropped some matches or you were talking, you were fined pay, and the pay was terrible as it was. So by the summer of 1888, conditions had got far too much. All of which was buoyed by an article written by Annie Besant, who we met before in my Gandhi in London video. She wrote an article called White Slavery in London, no subtlety there, about the conditions in this factory behind me, which got the public up in arms about the conditions of the match girls. And so in the July of 1888, the match girls decided to walk out of these gates in protest against the conditions. People came out in support for them and newspapers reported, and they were successful. Eventually, after 3 weeks, the strike was broken. The owners of Bryant and May said, okay, fine, we'll improve the conditions, we'll ban all these fines, we'll pay you better, just please come back to work. A great victory. But why is this significant? Well, obviously involving young women, and the plight of young women was highlighted. And again, this is before the suffrage movement was really starting to kick off. The voice of young women was being heard and their rights were being listened to finally. Also, it is one of the first big strikes of London that gets the notoriety, gets the newspaper coverage, etc. And by the late Victorian period, workers' rights becomes very significant. And the labour movement that will come in a few 20 years' time will use things like the Match Girl strike as their impetus. So significant, but now hard to access because it's rather posh flats. I am in Dagenham, and this is the closest I can get to the factory behind me, the huge Ford factory where they make all the Ford motor cars still today, and that they also did in 1968 when there was a significant strike. Once again, it involved women, specifically the women who were they made the covers for the car seats with their sewing machines, etc. Now, they were paid 15% less than the men who were doing the same job, and worse yet, they were classified as unskilled, whereas the men were not. Outrageous. And sure enough, in the summer of 1968, the women marched out. Now, their protest, as with all the other ones, got press coverage, but it escalated to another level when a government minister got involved, the Secretary of State for Employment and Provisions, and a woman known as Barbara Castle. She got involved and she became the mediator between the striking women and Ford, and eventually they bashed out a compromise. The women would get a raise of 7% and they would now be classified as semi-skilled. This is Grunwick Close, just around the back of Dollis Hill Tube Station in North London. And in 1976, these flats were not here. On location here was the Grunwick Film Processing Plant, a place where they made films for cameras. And in the summer of 1976, right through into 1978, a very significant strike or labour dispute happened here. It had the usual causes: bad conditions, disrespect from the management, bad pay, etc. But the significant difference was who was striking. It was women, South Asian women, who are actually many come from the East Asian diaspora from Uganda, pushed out by Idi Amin, but South Asian women who had had enough of the terrible conditions. It was obviously charged by the fact that they felt, probably quite rightly, that they were considered at the bottom of society, both by the people who own the factory, but generally by everyone, and that's why they were paid so badly and treated so badly as well. So In August of 1976, the long hot summer of 1976, the women, led by Jaya-Ben Desai, who has a criminally small plaque here, they walked out in protest. Now initially they didn't actually get much support even from the union movement. The union movement distanced themselves. Traditionally the union movement had been dominated by white men, and there was an element of misogyny and racism within that. However, by the spring of 1977, the Labour Union, specifically a union called APEX, A-P-E-X, and the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, decided to come out in support of the women. And so solidarity strikes by miners and others came here to North London in protest. Indeed, they were out there on Chapter Road by Dollis Hill Tube Station, marching on, making great speeches. Indeed, Jaya-Ben Desai made a speech directed towards the owners here of the factory, saying, "You are not owning a factory, you are owning a zoo," and with huge cheers, etc. Sadly, it did come into violence and there were police clashes with the protesters, and actually the image of that, because obviously this was on the news, the image of police fighting with women in their saris, the strikers and the saris as they were known, obviously got a lot of public support for the strike as well. Sadly though, it wasn't a successful strike or a labour dispute. By the 1978, the strike was called off. Many of the women had lost their jobs. Jaya-Ben Desai was pushed aside. The owners of the factory had won. So sadly, not a success for the workers, but it still has a significance. It was the start, 1977, the start of the huge winter of discontent, all these solidarity strikes that were going to come about, that were going to push the end of the Labour government started. But most importantly, it highlighted the plight of women and highlighted the plight of women, ethnic minorities here in Britain, how terribly they were treated, and suddenly now they get in more of the limelight. And indeed, they're the ones now with the plaques and the murals, not the owners of the factory, which is no longer here. So I suppose in the long run, not much consolation, they are the victors. I am in Wapping, Pennington Street to be precise, and that building behind me in the late 1980s was the new headquarters for News International, Rupert Murdoch's media empire that owned the Times of London, the Sun, and what would become Sky, etc. Now, on the street here was a huge industrial dispute when they moved offices. They had moved from Fleet Street up near St Paul's Cathedral, that main drag there, the traditional home of the London press. Rupert Murdoch decided to move News International here. Why? Well, in that building, he installed new computerized printing system so that the newspapers could be printed using computers, meaning that he no longer needed to employ the 6,000 human beings that were used to print the newspapers, not by hand, but operate the machines. It meant they lost their jobs. So obviously, in protest, they came out in strike, and they were lining up in the streets around here for several months, clashes with the police, etc., all the things that you would expect with a strike. Sadly though, unfortunately, it didn't work. Rupert Murdoch was able to keep the business going with non-union based employers, people who still were happy to work without union representation, and obviously the new computerized system worked, and so the strike failed for the workers. This is significant because this happened at the end of the 1980s, and it really symbolized the end of union power, the end of the power of strikes, these things we've been looking at. Through through a long history, but specifically 1970s, 1980s, strikes were becoming bigger and bigger, but becoming less and less powerful, and companies and politicians, people like Rupert Murdoch, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, were standing fast against the strikes, and eventually that union power waned. By the late 1980s, that certainly was the case, symbolised here by the Wapping dispute. This seems like a good place to end, really, the place where perhaps the power of strikes ended in Britain. And actually, many of the strikes we've been looking at have been interesting. Not many of them have been very successful. The Match Girl Day strike, of course, but here in Wapping, no, not really. The Grunwick, that wasn't successful, and Dagenham was sort of half successful. So sadly, maybe there's been a bit of sad history of strikes that haven't quite been a part of it. But then again, workers' rights have improved since Victorian times. Of course they have. There has been progress. Some people definitely would think that the journey still is going on and there still needs to be some improvement, but maybe the power of strikes is less. However, London does have a wonderful history of strikes. As always, I hope you've enjoyed that. Please let me know if I've missed anything out, if there's any other strikes that would be interesting. As always, please don't forget to subscribe. and I'll see you on the next one.